Good day, my friends. I hope y'all are doing fantastic. Welcome to another episode of the Pain and Performance Podcast. On today's show, I'm going to dive into a very kind of misconstrued but very important topic that I think applies to everyone. I don't think applies to everyone. This absolutely applies to everyone. And it's something that I think gets talked about a lot in a bunch of different kind of circles about who should have muscle mass, who should have strength, how we should work on that. And we apply these different answers to everyone. Yet when we start to dig into the research about this crazy connection through so many different avenues of muscle and overall health, that we need to understand that muscle strength, muscle mass is not something that is purely reserved for like bodybuilders and stuff like that. This is something that we all should pay attention to, and we've continued to increase our attention to it with our patients. And when we get this area under control, it just makes so many areas of our health easier to obtain. So we're going to dive into a lot of stuff, and you're going to have to question some maybe misconceptions about what having and building muscle mass means. And I think you're going to want to get this into the hands of some friends and family that you might know. With that, much appreciated to everyone who has shared the show. The feedback we continue to get is fantastic. It allows us to get some amazing guests. We have coming up some fantastic guests that you're definitely going to want to hear. And that's because we get reviews, we get shares, we continue to grow the show. And that's all because of you, amazing people. So I could not move on without saying thank you. I really appreciate everything that everyone has said about the show. And it really just continues to give me a crazy amount of joy whenever people are talking about how much you get out of this. So let's talk about the nitty gritty of muscle mass. So whenever we start to look at all the things that muscle mass touches in our health, we start to kind of have this mind-blown idea that this maybe should be the lead domino in a lot of health transformation is, can I start to create more muscle mass? And that might sound like a very, very grandiose statement. But as we go through some of this data and some of this research, I think that you'll agree with me that muscle mass and its role in health is almost more important than anything else that we can look at. And at least it creates a situation where all other areas of health are easier to obtain. So let's dive in. Let's talk about initially, what does muscle mass afford us? Having muscle mass, having muscle strength in our body, what does that give us? So we're going to talk about its role in a number of different mechanisms. So let's first start with muscle mass and metabolism and weight management. This is something that we see a lot. I know a lot of people who have started working towards improving their overall health, their metabolism, their body fat percentage, their weight management, their overall energy. And a lot of times we have different ideas about where to start with that. A lot of time it's, diet. A lot of time it's supplements. And what I will say is I think that it should start with muscle. And when you look at it, muscle, unlike other tissues in our body, burns more calories even at rest, something called our resting metabolic rate, than almost any other type of tissue. I think it's beat out by the brain. So when we look at this, you say this heightened calorie expenditure of muscles can be attributed to quite a few different things. When muscle tissue is in high abundance, the metabolic activity there continues to require energy for maintenance. So even at rest, the more muscle you have, the more energy that's required to keep that muscle healthy. So in those situations, essential functions such as supporting organ function, maintaining posture, regulating your body temperature, keeping muscle cells healthy, muscle fibers healthy, have this high energy demand that includes things like protein synthesis to keep the proteins building the muscle there, repairing those and maintaining them. That creates this high metabolic rate, even at rest, even when you're sitting there doing nothing. That means that anything that we're taking in is going to be put to use much better. It's going to be put to use much faster. So as muscle mass increases, so does the requirement of using the calories that we take in. So I'm going to kind of come back to that here in just a second, because this plays a very important role. As we have more muscle mass, we have more mitochondria. The mitochondria is what actually produces the energy in our body, and that's what actually requires the energy in our body. So, the type of muscle fiber that we possess plays a little bit of a role in this, but I think by and large, the more muscle mass that you have, the more you're going to be able to use the calories that you take in for good. And this can be, and I think points to a lot of the research around, the quality of the food that you take in is more important than the type. So if it's a high quality carbohydrate and you have good muscle mass, guess what? Those calories actually go to helping the muscles and the energy that the muscles need to stay healthy. The protein that you eat helps go towards protein synthesis to repair and rebuild the muscles that you have. So when we start looking at metabolism and everybody talking about a slow versus a fast metabolism, what we are often kind of alluding to that doesn't get talked about a lot is that we are talking about muscle. Do you have muscle requirements in your body to use the calories you take in? If you, and I would beg to answer the question of people saying, oh, my metabolism slowed down. I will bet you that 9 times out of 10, when someone says that, their muscle mass has dropped. It's not that their metabolism has actually slowed down miraculously. It's that they don't need that many calories to function, to actually go in and keep those muscles healthy, because they have less muscle mass. So their body doesn't know what to do with those extra calories. So it just stores them for a while. And they feel like, hey, my metabolism is going down. This is why when we're trying to look at increasing our metabolism, we're trying to look at increasing our metabolic rate, our metabolic health, that we need to increase muscle mass so that everything else, that's the lead domino that puts all these other things into motion. And we have to be working on that. We're going to get into kind of what that looks like here shortly, but I just want to kind of drive home that point that, muscle is what creates the metabolic load in a lot of ways, just because it's got so much more need than the other types of tissue. So when we're, if we look at the benefits of burning more calories at rest, and that's again largely due to this higher muscle mass, it helps to keep weight management at the forefront by facilitating this calorie expenditure throughout the day. Just having muscle mass means you're burning more calories all day. I can't, to put it as simply as possible. This is also linked to significantly improved insulin sensitivity and better blood sugar control and reducing the risk of type 2 diabetes. So if you're looking at blood sugar control, the muscle mass that we have is what takes blood sugar or sugar. The muscle mass that we have is what takes the sugar out of the blood in a lot of ways. So insulin is the hormone that gets produced by the pancreas that plays this really important role in regulating blood sugar levels. When you consume like a carbohydrate, your blood glucose levels rise. In response to that blood sugar, the pancreas releases insulin into the bloodstream. You have these things called GLUT4 transporters. I'm going to just explain this a little bit. One of the kind of key actions of insulin in muscle cells is to stimulate the translocation of glucose, that GLUT4, into the muscle cell for energy. So this GLUT4 receptor, this GLUT4 transporter, is responsible for transporting the glucose out of the blood and into your muscle. It is very, very important that we can do that. If we can't do that, our blood sugar levels remain high, and that starts to create the situation that will lead to diabetes. So when you start to dig in the research, muscle mass or low muscle mass has a very direct correlation with diabetic risk, with diabetes. So the more muscle mass we have, the more that facilitates the clearing of glucose from your bloodstream by increasing the number of muscle cells available to respond to insulin whenever we're eating those things. So insulin stimulates the translocation of GLUT4 to the cell surface, which allows the uptake of glucose into the muscle cell out of the bloodstream. So with more muscle mass, we are able to clear more blood glucose, and we're able to keep our blood sugar under control and keep our insulin sensitivity, which is one of the major things that we need to be able to accomplish to stay healthy. When you look at all of the research around Alzheimer's, around different types of cancer, around aging, maintaining healthy blood sugar is on the top of the list for many of those things. And we can't do that very effectively if we don't have the muscle mass and to be able to maintain and control glucose whenever we're taking it in. So, in a very interesting way, we start to look at having that muscle mass as the lead domino. It's really hard if you don't have that for you to out diet low muscle mass. I know people talk about it all the time. You can't, outwork a bad diet. The reverse is absolutely true. If you don't have the muscle mass, it is really, really difficult. You have to almost be perfect. And we don't need to do that. We just can build the muscle we need. And that makes everything else easier. We have better insulin sensitivity. We can clear more blood sugar. That gives our muscles more energy. We have to keep using them. The more we use them, the more we burn through that. And the cycle continues to get better and better. So it's really important for us to have muscle mass in a lot of ways when we're looking at metabolic health, weight management, blood sugar management, muscle mass, and building the muscle in our body so that we have enough to be able to create healthy function in all these areas is probably the lead step that we should take. If you ask me, I think it puts the lead domino effect into place where we're starting to make all these other things kind of much, much easier. And it gives us the ability to create this positive momentum, this positive cycle that continues and creates these large changes in our body much easier. So we're not fighting to get the change. So, basically, if you have more muscle mass, you're going to have better metabolism, better metabolic health. You're going to have an easier time burning calories, not storing calories, not storing sugars. So we're going to be able to burn fat much easier. We have a much higher engine or much faster engine. So you're going to burn through that stuff. Even your stored calories as fat will get burned at some point. The more muscle we have, you're going to control your blood sugar much better. And you're going to have better insulin sensitivity throughout your body. So quite important. Another thing that we look at when we're talking about muscle mass and overall health is this connection between muscle mass and bone health. So when you look at the research, muscle mass is positively correlated with bone health. So the more muscle mass we have, the more positive or healthy our bone density is. So we have a lower risk of osteoporosis. We have a lower likelihood of fractures. We have less falls that lead to issues with bones. So having that muscle mass, I think, is kind of a correlation of bone health, because when you're building muscle mass and you're keeping that muscle mass, you have to be doing that with work. It doesn't just happen. And so when you're doing that, you're also doing the things that increase tension and stress and rebuilding of your bones, which create a healthier environment for them, especially as we age. So a number of studies have examined the relationship between muscle mass and bone health. They often will look at bone mineral density, DEXA, quantitative ultrasounds, and it consistently demonstrates that people with greater muscle mass have higher bone mineral density and have lower risk of fractures. So the muscle tissue produces hormones and growth factors like insulin-like growth factor, growth hormone, and these play a very important role in bone remodeling to support bone health. And the muscle contractions, like we were saying, they release this bone strengthening hormone, osteocalcin, which goes in and reinforces the bone. It's the signal that our body sends that, hey, I'm using these muscles, which means I must be pulling on the bone. So for us to make this activity easier in the future, we should have stronger bones. And so our body is really smart about that. And it's like, hey, let's release this thing. If the muscles are going to get used more, the bones are going to have more stress. Let's go ahead and kind of jump the gun and strengthen the bones. So it's a really interesting phenomenon. At least some component of this is known as Wolff's Law, which is the mechanical stress placed on bones during muscle contractions triggers the minerals like calcium and phosphate, leading to increased bone density and strength. So, tapping into that Wolff's Law to increase our bone health and reduce the risk of osteoporosis is a very good thing. And we want to start that as early as possible. So to kind of run back through this before I keep going, because it's going to stack up really quickly, good muscle mass is going to help with metabolism. It's going to help with weight management. It's going to help with blood sugar. It's going to help with insulin sensitivity. Those are somewhat one and the same. It's going to help with hormone balance. It's going to help with bone health. So let's dive a little bit into the hormone side of things, because this was a very interesting area to start looking at muscle mass and what it can do from a hormone level. We talk about hormones a lot, and I think we get into a lot of the different things we need to do in today's world to maintain hormone balance. And we talk about stress and we talk about a lot of these issues. But I think when you look at the muscle mass thing, it's kind of brushed off to the side. Let's not talk about that. That's maybe that's a little bit difficult for us to hear. But if we look at how muscle mass affects hormone production, like testosterone, growth hormone, we'll tie that back into cortisol and dopamine. Muscle mass is very highly linked to hormone production and regulation. That when we exercise, and a lot of people, we talk about the runner's high, we talk about the muscle pump after a strength training session. When we exercise, the development of muscle mass can positively impact the levels of and sensitivity of hormones, including testosterone, including growth hormone, including dopamine. It can change or alter insulin, as we've talked about, leptin, cortisol, the stress hormone that gets talked about a lot. And when we change these hormonal responses, we can change many, many areas of our health. So again, you start going back to this stuff and you're like, I think a lot of the relationship, if we start looking at how do we tap into the lead dominoes in health, muscle mass is one of those that it's a lead domino. And if you've ever seen one of those little things where like there's the front little domino and there's like 5 or 6 rows that all take off whenever you tap that very first one, muscle seems to be that for a lot of different things. We tap that domino and boom, we're able to set off not only, that one single row of hundreds of dominoes falling, but 5 or 6 rows of hundreds of dominoes falling, and falling into, the right order and doing the right things for us. So it's just one of those things that as we study, I get more and more interested in people paying attention to their muscle mass and working on that starting at a very early age. So if we look at testosterone, growth hormone, progesterone. We know that working out, strengthening, and creating muscle stress through a workout program, and I'll explain a little bit of what that is. But let's say we're trying to build muscle mass and muscle strength. We're going to have to lift heavy. We're going to have to get closer to failure. If we do that, we stimulate the increase in needing to build muscle, which stimulates growth hormone release. That's going to upregulate testosterone in both men and women, which is very important for health. I don't want people to think that that's not a good thing. It's a good thing across the board for everyone to get those hormones released. That's what helps rebuild. That's what helps repair. It's very good for our brain. So getting into the training for that helps to get those main hormones, testosterone, growth hormone, progesterone, into very good levels and higher levels, which is a reason, as an aside, for men who have low testosterone, one of the first things we start telling them to do is start making some of these changes in terms of how they're training for a little while and how they're lifting to start to increase the need for testosterone in their body. And as long as they're doing a number of other things and they have mechanisms working, it's a very good thing to start getting that in good levels. Now, one of the things that I thought was very interesting when we look at muscle mass and its effects of hormone is cortisol. So cortisol is the stress hormone that we all talk about, that high levels of stress cause high levels of cortisol, and it creates this, massive negative effect in the body. Well, cortisol can actually be a catabolic hormone, which means that it breaks down muscle when it stays elevated. So muscle mass can actually decrease or speed the rate at which cortisol lowers after a heightened event. So this is an inverse relationship. If you have high cortisol for a long period of time, you'll want to have lower muscle mass. So we had a while back, we had Jace Lopez on the podcast, and we were talking about some of the lead things he sees whenever somebody starts to hit a plateau or they start to have trouble gaining muscle and changing their body. And one of the first things he said he would do is tell them to start taking ashwagandha. I thought it was a very interesting thing at the time that, you would take this, kind of brain health stress supplement for somebody who is on a physical plateau. But when you start looking at these things, you say, man, it actually will start to flip that inverse relationship if we can bring down cortisol and we take away that catabolic effect that the stress hormone causes. It allows us the opportunity to grow muscle mass better. Love ashwagandha, by the way. I think it's a wonderful compound, wonderful supplement that we have people take, especially when they're dealing with stressful situations. We'll take in kind of higher doses for a little while, and then we'll drop down to lower doses after, say, 3 to 6 weeks of taking a higher dose. We don't want to chronically just suppress cortisol very, very deeply, because once we get it down to a normal level, then, those short-term spikes in cortisol can be good. But left to its own devices of high stress and chronically elevated cortisol, we will actually inhibit muscle development to a very significant degree. So we need to build the muscle mass to keep cortisol down. We need to keep cortisol down to build muscle mass. So it's a very, very interesting relationship that I think is incredible for a lot of people to know. If you have dealt with these issues, and it seems like when you have stressful situations, you have a tough time coming out of it, you may not be able to kind of clear that cortisol very well, and building muscle is a great way to do it. If you start are exercising and you're trying to build muscle and you keep running into a wall, stress and cortisol might be the reason that you're running into a wall. So a very interesting relationship between those two that I don't know if I've ever heard anyone talk about it. But another hormone that gets quite the uptick whenever we look at muscle mass is dopamine. Dopamine is primarily associated with our brain's reward system and mood regulation. muscle tissue contains dopamine receptors, which is a very interesting thing. You have dopamine that gets released, and that in our brain, that makes us feel good. That increases, our mood, and we feel great. Exercise, specifically resistance training, can lead to the release of dopamine, and it contributes to this feel good effect after exercise that everyone, talks about in terms of, increasing that. And I think that happens so that we increase our motivation and pleasure from the activity, so that we actually adhere and continue moving well. If every time we exercise, especially if you think that we were wired to go and survive and hunt for food, gather food, grow food, if every time we went and did that and it was tough, we didn't get this little boost in mood, we might not do that very well, and we wouldn't survive very easily. So the people who had a bigger dopamine response from exercise did more of it, did more of these healthy activities, and so they survived better. And I think that's where that comes into play. But it is a very good thing. If you're ever feeling down, if you're ever feeling frustrated, or you just can't quite seem to get that mood regulation, getting more muscle mass means that we have more dopamine receptors and we can release dopamine easier with exercise. So, in the very beginning, if you don't have a ton of muscle mass, you might not get as big of a dopamine response. And, that lifter's high, that runner's high might not be as attainable for you in the beginning. But as you grow muscle mass and you have more and more of muscle tissue to draw from, you have more and more dopamine receptors in that tissue, you're going to be able to tap into this kind of mood boosting system a lot easier. I know back years and years ago, I started trying to run long distance. And after about a month or two of it, I was like, this runner's high thing is bull. Like, all I do, I go, I run, I don't feel great. I'm doing it for health. I don't particularly like it. My body's built for short speed bursts, and I'm going to try and run 4 to 6 miles. And after, let's say, 3 or 4 months of doing this, probably 3 times a week, I was living in Baton Rouge at the time. I was running the lakes. And I remember this one day where the weather was a little bit better, and I got out and I was running, and about halfway through, instead of thinking about how hard it was or, how tired I was, my brain went to almost this thought of I wonder how fast I can do it today. I'd been tracking my time. I feel good. And I finished that run. It was the best time I had. But even more than that, I felt just this elation of, oh man, that felt wonderful. My body feels great. My brain feels great. My mood is excellent. And it was the first time that I've even got a semblance of the runner's high. And I think that was building up these, dopamine receptors, building up these sites, building up the engine inside to be able to release enough of that. And it took a while. So it may be some of that if you say, I've never gotten that. I've never gotten the exercise high. I've never gotten the runner's high or the lifter's high, that we just have to build enough of the tissue, enough of the engine in there to do it. Insulin is another very important hormone that is involved in glucose regulation. We spent quite a bit of time, but our muscle tissue plays just an absolutely critical role in glucose metabolism. If we don't have muscle mass, to not beat a dead horse, we're going to have a very tough time clearing glucose. So make sure that we're paying attention to some of that, but having better muscle mass improves our ability to respond to insulin, which helps us clear glucose out of the bloodstream. I do want to mention leptin. Leptin is a very important hormone when it comes to health transformation, specifically when it comes to body fat. Excuse me. So leptin is produced by fat cells that regulates appetite and energy balance. Muscle tissue can influence leptin sensitivity. We want to be quite sensitive to leptin. Whenever we have more muscle mass, we improve our leptin signaling, which helps us to regulate our body weight and metabolism much, much better. And there's a lot of kind of dietary supplements and things like that that try to act on this. So they try to actually improve leptin signaling through a number of different mechanisms. And when you really start digging into the research, you say like muscle mass is the way to improve that the best. So the more muscle mass we have, the better we can respond to leptin, the better we can promote proper body weight, metabolism, fat cell storage, breakdown, all of these things that can really improve and alter fat storage and body composition is the big thing with leptin. Are we going to burn those fat cells? So having muscle mass, very important to be able to get the signal from leptin. And so I think that's a very, very poorly talked about section of weight loss and health in general. But if we move on to kind of discuss the age-related decline in muscle mass, basically, so this is sarcopenia, right? Sarcopenia is the shrinking or the decline of muscle mass that happens as we go through life. And this affects, you look at the studies, because our activity levels are changing, anywhere from 25 to 50% of the population are dealing with sarcopenia over the age of 65. So they're losing significant amounts of muscle mass. And when we start to look at some of the research around this, they had a really good review on sarcopenia in relation with type 2 diabetes that focused on the relation of type 2 diabetes and sarcopenia. If you go back to our previous discussion on muscle mass and how important it is with clearing blood sugar or blood glucose, do you think that the findings of this study are anything but of a surprise if you understand that mechanism is how we clear blood sugar? If we don't have the muscle mass, we're going to have a spike in type 2 diabetes. And guess what this study showed? The prevalence of type 2 diabetes is high in many of the people who are dealing with sarcopenia. So those two run exactly together, which is exactly what you would expect if you understand this mechanism. And so we can attack this from both ways, right? We can try and go the easy way where, we have type 2 diabetes. Let's treat it chemically. Let's take a pill. But if we still don't have those receptors, we don't have the insulin receptors, we don't have the GLUT4 transporters because we don't have enough muscle mass in our body, we can keep treating that chemically, but we're going to have a really difficult time improving diabetic outcomes and diagnosis. So if you look at the typical response to this, we're treating it with medicine. I think we should flip it over. I think in a lot of those people who are pre-diabetic and who are starting to have blood sugar issues, hint, make sure you're getting this tested regularly, that we should start a strength training and a muscle mass building program, which we're going to get to shortly. The rate of muscle loss after 40 is roughly about 8% every 10 years. So just around 1% a year. And after age 70, that speeds up. That speeds up quite a bit, up to 2 to 3% a year after age 70. So part of what that tells us is that we need to increase muscle mass and muscle strength, whoever you are, wherever you are right now listening to this, whatever age you are. We need to increase muscle mass now because you are going to see a little bit of a decline as you age. That's a typical rate. We can slow it down and you can work like crazy to slow it down, but decline is going to happen. Where and when does that decline happen and how fast is going to depend on how much muscle mass you have today. The higher we are, the further it's going to take us to have low muscle mass. The more we're working, the slower that rate's going to be. We'll be on the slower end of the curve. And that means that we have more muscle mass at older ages, and all these mechanisms that muscle mass relates to still work pretty well, even if we're 90 or 100. If you listen to the last episode on the secrets of the blue zones and you understand how much those people move and function and exercise, the reason that they have low levels of diabetes, low levels of Alzheimer's, part of that is they have and they use muscles all the time. So they keep that muscle mass up and they keep all those mechanisms that requires high muscle mass functioning very well. So when we look at this, there's got to be an emphasis for healthcare professionals to start recognizing the role that muscle mass plays, not only in many of these health issues in terms of metabolism, weight management, diet, but blood sugar and hormone balance. We have to start recognizing how important it is to tell our patients that if you don't do this, everything else is going to be a Band-Aid. You're going to have a really tough time getting these areas under control. So there's a wonderful study that I'll link to in the show notes called A Narrative Review on Sarcopenia. And it goes through and illustrates this relationship very beautifully. So check that out if you want the nitty gritty of the facts of some of this stuff. To carry on what a little bit of that study does is kind of goes in and talks about when we have low muscle mass, and this is what we've talked about already, our risk of cognitive and functional decline is going to be quite high. One thing that we probably haven't mentioned to a very high degree is when we have low muscle mass, it is quite highly associated with poor cognitive function. And that's something that, when we look at the relationship, we may not know which way it is, but we know that if we do the right things and we exercise and we create muscle strength and muscle mass, that we get on the right side of that curve and we improve our chances of maintaining cognitive function as long as we possibly can. Because of the hormone levels, the article also talks about depression, the link between sarcopenia or low muscle mass and depressive symptoms. As we've talked about already, you're going to have a tough time balancing hormones if we don't have the muscle mass to function correctly. And that can lead to issues with kind of some of these kind of depression related hormones going unchecked or elevating unchecked, and some of them decreasing unchecked. And that puts us in a situation where stress and depression are quite likely. So check that article out. I think it does a good job of talking a lot about the different effects of sarcopenia and the impact of its issues on physical function, psychosocial health, and all of the above. So strength may be the trump card in terms of almost all of these areas of health, even more important than stuff like cardiorespiratory health in terms of reducing all of our risk factors, reducing all-cause mortality. We've talked a lot on here about how muscle mass actually can change the predictive kind of scale for all-cause mortality in any one decade. So the highest group, the most muscle mass versus the lowest muscle mass, have about a 5x difference in all-cause mortality. So a 500% difference in death because of muscle mass, with everything else being equal. So it is extremely important. And the reason that number exists, that 500% exists, is because of the things that we've talked about, of muscle mass playing this central role in all of these mechanisms in our body. And I'm a why person. If we started telling people from a young age that this is why you need to work on muscle, I think more people would say, oh, it's not for vanity. It's not for, this thing that may happen in the future. You might live longer. You might, look better. You might function better. No, it's because it is the lead domino for so many of the natural mechanisms that your body needs to be able to do to function well. So what do we do with that information? That's a lot, right? Muscle mass is a very huge and important thing. So how do we actually build and work on muscle mass? I think in some ways, when you start studying this, it gets a little bit into the weeds because the research is kind of like wishy-washy in some ways. But in general, what it says is the more you do, the better your muscles are going to be. So if in doubt, do more exercise. There's very few people that are over exercising. There's some people out there, and I'll probably get some hate mail on this one, but I don't see those people very often that are actually overusing things anymore or over exercising. I think when it comes to this stuff, if you look at the research around it, if you're training the right way, if you do more exercise, you're going to have more muscle mass by and large. If we look at building muscle. So you're going to have to do resistance training. You're going to have to actually build muscle to do this. And that means that you're going to have to push and exercise those muscles using resistance. You're going to be going against weights. You're going to be pushing. You're going to be using machines, whatever you know how to do. If you don't know how to exercise or move effectively for a little while, get a personal trainer who's going to take you through the form so that you can do this stuff and not get injured. But we have to be able to push our body and muscles closer to failure. If you look at the research around building muscle mass and strength, what it says is that we need to train that at pretty close to failure to get the muscle to grow. So if you're exercising, what that means is that you should be getting within 5 repetitions of what would be considered your failure point, where you would no longer be able to do that move without significantly compromising your form or being able to do the repetition. So that is 5 repetitions of failure. And that's, if you do that in a set, let's say you get to number 12 and you're like, I have maybe 2 or 3 more reps, and then I'm going to start really having to shift around, and I don't know if I can even get this weight up doing that. Then you got what we would consider a hard set. So you did a set that you got close to failure on, and that's a check mark. I did one hard set today. Do this after you warm up. But, you know, if for example, you know, I'm recording this on a Sunday, Monday is leg day for me. I get in there, I do my warm up sets, and let's say I'm doing squat for my heavy weight that day. What I'm going to do is, you know, do 3 or 4 warm up sets. I'm doing low weight, getting warm, getting loosened up, making sure I'm moving well, making sure I feel good. And then I'm going to start at a moderate weight, and I'm going to go until I start to get pretty close to where I'm like, I'm running out. I'm running out of repetitions. And I'm going to try and get to that, you know, 3 to 5 repetitions close to failure. And that may take me more repetitions with that first one because I'm doing a lighter weight. So I'll rack that. Let's say that takes me 15, 16 repetitions. So now I'm going to rest and I'll add some weight. Then I go back and I'm trying to, at the new weight, you know, let's say I'll put, you know, 50 more pounds on the bar. I'm going to try to do the exact same thing. Can I get close to failure within 3 to 5 repetitions at this weight? And when we look at this in one workout for that muscle group, to really stimulate muscle mass changes and muscle growth, we should shoot for roughly 6 to 8 hard sets for that muscle group. As you can kind of imagine, this is significant. This takes some time, and there is variability in the research on this. So it says, like, you know, 6 to 12. If you listen to Lane Norton, who I think puts out some really good research on muscle mass, you know, he would say, you know, you can do 6 to 12. You could do 12 hard sets in a workout. If you listen to him, you have to recover a tremendous amount between each of those sets. So if you did do, and we're trying to do effectively 12 hard sets in a workout, you might be in the gym for 2 hours, 3 hours to really do that correctly. So the big issue with this that I see in a lot of people, especially in the aging population, is that we're not training our muscles close to failure hardly ever. Now, make sure you're doing this in a safe way, but the true answer is we have to do it. We have to get close to that if we're going to maintain and strengthen our muscles. And when we're looking at a lot of this stuff, rest and recovery is important, because the fresher we go into a set, the closer we can get to our true absolute failure. And what this means is, like, if I do all those things with almost no rest in between, let's say I get up and I'm doing 300 pounds on squat, but I've done, you know, 5 or 6 sets leading up to that, and I took almost no rest. I'm going to get up underneath that and barely be able to get a few repetitions before I say to myself, I'm about to fail. I'm almost to muscle failure. But that's not my true, like, muscle failure. That's because I'm fatigued. The closer we get to doing a lot of sets at my absolute muscle failure, which would be me rested and warmed up, and then I put the 300 on there and I may be able to do 10. And now I'm at like, oh, okay, I'm close. The closer we are to that, the better the training we get. But we don't all have a lot of time to rest like that in between, to where I almost come to each set fully recovered, unless we're doing this as a job. But I still think that for all of us, if we aim for 6 to 8 hard sets of the area we're focused on during that time period, which I'll come to in a minute, is going to significantly change your outcomes. Look, I've got patients that we do this on for 6 weeks, and because they have not been training this way, their muscle mass just skyrockets. So it's really something that your body wants to do. It wants muscle mass. It uses it for all those functions we were talking about. We just need to make sure that we're giving it the stimulus to do it. And if you're not training closer to failure, you're not going to get that muscle mass. So we've talked about this quite a bit, but when we do this, there's quite a bit of research that says our body can possibly acclimate to muscle mass or muscle volume training. And if I'm training like this for a long period of time, my body can get used to it. And so if we cycle in and out of this type of volume where I'm training awfully close to failure for a specific muscle, it gets a better response. And the way we can use this is that we should have, in my opinion, a couple of areas that we're focusing on to increase our strength and muscle mass for a given period of time. Let's say 6 to 12 weeks. And I might just pick 2 things. I might pick glutes and biceps. And for 6 to 12 weeks, my focus is I'm doing this type of volume training where I'm getting close to failure in exercises for glutes and for biceps. And I'm doing that, 2 to 3 times a week. During this time period, I'm probably just maintaining in other areas. So I'm still doing all the other areas. I'm still working chest. I'm still working back. But I'm doing it in a little more of a maintenance phase, so that in the 6 to 12 weeks later, when I rotate and maybe, my chest and my back are now my focus for muscle mass growth, this cyclical volume training means that those muscles are going to respond better and grow more during their focused 6 to 12 week session than if I just train them all at that high level the whole time. So if we kind of go in and out, it takes very little to maintain muscle mass, but it takes a lot of volume to grow muscle mass and muscle strength. So it does make some sense that if throughout a year we said like, hey, for this 6 weeks block, I'm really focused on A and B. And then after that, so I'm going to go to maintenance phase on those. They've grown over that 6 weeks, and now I just maintain that growth and I shift my focus to another body part. And I use 6 to 12 weeks to grow those body parts while I maintain the other ones. And I just continue to cycle through this. This does take a little bit of focus, and you can do it intuitively if you've hit a plateau with something. If you hit a plateau with some area of your body, it's probably that it has acclimated to the volume, and you would actually do better of going into a maintenance mode for a month or 2 on that area, train something else, really focus on growing another area, and then come back to the area that you had a plateau with. And I bet you that you will restart that volume kind of acclimation period, and you'll be able to get off of that plateau quite easily. So this kind of volume cycling is what you would call it. Really does help us to minimize the amount of time that we need to spend, because look, we all still have lives, that we need to spend in the gym, so that we can focus and actually put the amount of volume and training in to grow the areas that we need to throughout a whole year to keep our body healthy. If it's me and we're talking about what we need to grow, we should cycle through glutes, hamstrings, quads, core, chest, shoulders, triceps, biceps, and we should be cycling through that all year. I may have missed some in there. Don't hold me to that list. I'm just creating that off. But we should basically, the big movers that keep us functional should have a little block throughout our year somewhere in there where for, that 6 to 12 weeks, I'm focused on doing the volume to grow that body part. I hope that makes sense. If you have questions, please shoot them over to me. I'd love to kind of answer any questions about how this needs to happen. But if we're starting to train like that, and we're starting to get muscle growth, and we're starting to get these changes, and we're starting to increase muscle mass, and the downstream effects of everything we've talked about are starting to get going, we feel really, really good. How do we speed that up? I get the question all the time. What can we do to make this process work better or work faster? So let's dive into a couple of things. The first one that I want to talk about is vitamin D. So there was a really neat study that came out on vitamin D that found that specifically in men, although I would say that if we looked at levels, people with low vitamin D are going to all qualify for this, that there was a significant and direct correlation with improving vitamin D levels and improving skeletal muscle mass. So if you don't have vitamin D, I'm going to include this study in the show notes, by the way. If you don't have enough circulating vitamin D, it's going to be tough for you to build the muscle mass that you need. So check your vitamin D levels. I'm going to say a lot of these things. I prefer people to check these things and to actually know what their levels are. But vitamin D is crucial for us to have muscle mass. So very, very important. I'm going to go through a couple of these. One of the most amazing breakthroughs in the last couple of years that I have seen in terms of anabolic resistance training and growing muscle is in the field of omega-3s. I've talked about omega-3s a lot. The more research that comes out on them, the more they start to creep to the front of my number one compound that we should all be taking. If you look at omega-3s in mental health, if you look at them in stress and depression, if you look at them in nerve health and inflammation, you're like, this thing is incredible. And add this to the list. So Dr. Chris McGlory put out some studies where in high doses, they found that they could reduce anabolic resistance to muscle building in these disuse atrophy trials. So basically, let me explain it. What he did was he gave young women 5 grams of omega-3 fatty acids, 3 grams of EPA, 2 grams of DHA, or a placebo for 4 weeks. They had to wear a brace on one of their legs so that they could not use the muscles very well. And what they studied was muscle protein synthesis during immobilization. So if you are not able to exercise, you have an injury, you have an issue, you break a leg, you injure a ligament, you tear your ACL, you name it, you're immobilized for some period of time. What he found was that women who took the omega-3s lost half as much muscle, 50% less muscle loss. That is huge. The amount of time and effort to regain that muscle, go back to what we were just talking about. How much volume do you need to grow muscle? That we have saved ourselves by taking an omega-3 in these situations when we're immobilized is significant. We may have shaved 3 to 6 months off of our recovery time, our muscle building time, by adding this in there. So when they take that, the resistance training to add to that study, what they did was they had people take the fish oil supplements in addition to resistance training. And what they found in this one was that they showed greater strength gains than those who took the placebo. So basically what they found is if you're taking it and you're not able to train, you're not going to lose as much muscle mass as people who are not taking omega-3s. If you are taking omega-3s and you're able to exercise, you're going to gain more muscle mass than people who are not taking it. So when we look at that, you're like, take omega-3s if we care about muscle mass. And if you've got to this point in this episode and you don't care about muscle mass, then maybe our relationship is not correct. No, I'm just kidding. But it's so important. And I think everyone who is going through this, unless you have some strange reason not to, omega-3s should be very, very high on your list to speed the improvements up with muscle mass. Can't put it any clearer way. Another thing that we look at in terms of speeding muscle mass development is sauna. And y'all have heard me talk about sauna a lot, but using sauna regularly while we're doing strength training can improve muscle regrowth by 30% in some studies. There's a study that I'll link also in the show notes or go to the blog post for all of these, that was titled The Effects of 12 Sessions of High Temperature Sauna Baths on Body Composition in Healthy Young Men. And what they did was they incorporated high temperature sauna, so 100 degrees Celsius, into their exercise routine. And specifically what the study found was that they had a significant positive change in muscle mass and bone mineral content. So remember what we were talking about earlier, the positive correlation in muscle mass and bone strength after the 12 sessions. So if we're looking at tapping into this muscle growth, this muscle development, doing sauna in conjunction with your strength training is going to be very important. When should you do that sauna? I like to do it after my strength training days, but the research seems to say that it does not matter. Whenever you can get that 25 minutes of sauna work in, it appears to increase and maintain the development of muscle mass and, by this study, bone health. So don't necessarily worry about doing it at the perfect time. If you have the time to do that, yes, structure it correctly, but get it done is the real answer. Another thing y'all have heard me talk about, but I'll mention it here since we're talking about ways to speed this up, is blood flow modification, specifically KAATSU. The growth hormone mechanisms that KAATSU provides to shortcut and increase growth hormone release to stimulate muscle mass growth is massive, 300% more than the equivalent exercise without the KAATSU bands or the blood flow modification bands. Go back and listen to episode 77 with Stephen Muñatones. You can go back. I love the episode number 4 where we just introduced KAATSU. If you've never heard of KAATSU or blood flow modification, that'd be a great place to start. All the way back to episode number 4. Thank you, Stephen, for joining the show that early on. But KAATSU is a really good way for you to tap into this. If you're having trouble building muscle, we've given a lot of tips on here, but adding the ability to do blood flow modification using KAATSU bands, I travel with mine, y'all have probably seen that, creates a really, really good way for you to do this and get close to that 5 repetition failure, even if you're using lower weights. So we're changing that metric, but the goal is still the same. We're still trying to get closer to our failure point. We can just do it easier with very low or no weights with KAATSU and get that growth hormone release and get that muscle mass development. So add that into your routine. Now's probably a good time for me to mention creatine. Creatine is kind of this substance that has gone in and out of favor for quite a few years. Creatine monohydrate has so much research on it. Excuse me. Creatine monohydrate has so much research on it that if you just start looking, you're going to find study after study after study. And there's many meta-analysis where they study a bunch of the studies. But if you look at creatine supplementation during resistance training, it's going to act as a phosphate donor, basically. So creatine turns into phosphocreatine in the muscle, so it helps to create more energy inside the muscle. It also helps to pull water into the muscles, which used to be something that we almost talked bad about. Oh, it's water. Your muscles are made up of 70% water in an ideal hydrated situation. So that is meaning that you are getting your muscles back to their normal state and making them healthier is what creatine does. So the research on it is incredible. If you look at taking creatine, it is effective in improving muscle strength, improving performance, improving resistance training, improving recovery. Creatine monohydrate just works. And if you're going to take one thing for muscle development, I would probably say start with creatine. If you're not taking that and you're starting to take some of these other things, it's probably the cheapest and it's the easiest. So take creatine, 5 grams a day. We used to do loading phases and all that stuff. I don't think you need to. Do your 5 grams a day and let that help you grow lean muscle mass. You should just take creatine. I do need to mention protein right here because it's really important that we are getting the building blocks to build muscle in our body. You can go back and listen to episode 68 to check this out, but we need about 0.8 grams per pound of body weight if you're going to grow muscle. You need to have that protein tissue to help stimulate muscle growth. Without protein, none of the other macronutrients will actually go towards building muscle. So the more muscle growth and training you do, the more protein you likely will need. If you're focused on volume training, like we've talked about here, to grow something, shoot for the 0.8. So that means, a 150, 160 pound person needs about 120 grams of protein. Just, you can do the math for yourself, but very, very important to get high quality and good protein in your diet. I do think that can come from many different ways. I do whey protein. I eat a lot of different types of protein. I try and get that with every single meal. I do collagen proteins, and I mix all of those things up to try and hit my protein goals every day. And it's still, you start looking at needing 120, 150, 180 grams of protein. You're going to have trouble if you're not paying attention to it. And I think that is one of the reasons that we also see people starting to lose muscle mass is they're not getting enough protein intake. And what's the ripple effect of that? Our protein intake's going down, our muscle mass is going down. We have trouble with, blood sugar regulation, our metabolism. So body fat percentage goes up, hormone dysregulation comes. So you can see how this starts to kind of get out of control. Flip it over. Let's go the positive route. Get the protein up, start doing some of these volume trainings, pick a couple body parts. Now we're increasing muscle mass. Now our metabolism is functioning better. Resting metabolic rate is better. Hormone control is better. We have better, dopamine. We have better mental health. You're getting better bone health. You go up and down the list. Let's tap into that positive momentum of building muscle mass. And I promise you, you will be happy that you did it, not only today, as the research said, but in the future. I would be remiss if I don't at least mention peptides here, although that is probably an entire podcast series in itself. Peptides have kind of taken the scene by storm in the last few years. And if we look at the different types that can help with muscle mass and muscle development, there's a lot. We can kind of go through a bunch of them: ModGRF, CJC, tesamorelin, ipamorelin. There's a bunch. You can study those. There's a lot that appear to be safe, that appear to be effective. But I'm going to caveat this. If you are at least interested in peptides, make sure you're working with a professional and you're doing this in a safe way where you're monitoring your other health metrics to do it. Peptides are quite powerful and we should treat them that way, but they can help in difficult situations, especially if you have done some of the tests and you say, I don't have growth hormone in levels I need. I don't have testosterone in levels I need, and I'm going to have a difficult time building muscle mass. Then a very, very good place to start would be looking at peptides. If you're already in that camp, fix all of your kind of baseline metrics. But if you're looking at some advanced stuff and you're in that camp where you've got some kind of dysfunction in the system, peptides are a really good place to go to improve some of that stuff and do it in a way that it's stimulating your body to improve it. I know that kind of may leave you with more questions than answers, but that's kind of where we'll leave peptides today. Let me know if you have questions about some of that stuff. I have seen people who started changing their muscle mass absolutely change every area of their health. I have a patient who is in her late 60s who at the end of her appointment about 2 years ago with me, she said, what should I do to stay healthy and to keep this pain from coming back? We went through a couple of the exercises and activities we talked about. And I was like, look, as a general, health perspective at your age, you need to increase your muscle mass for all the reasons we just talked about, but specifically bone health, metabolism, blood sugar regulation. And she said, okay, and walked out. This was probably a 10-minute conversation. And I didn't see her for a while. And then I ran into her and she had probably changed her body composition by 10 to 15%. She probably put on what looked to me like 20 pounds of muscle and dropped a ton of fat at 67, 68. And we started talking, and she's like, I'm doing exactly what you told me. I am going through, I'm working with a trainer, I'm building muscle mass. We're doing deadlifts. I'm doing stuff I never did in my life. I never exercised these things. And you know what? I feel younger now than I did when I was in my 40s. I have more muscle mass and strength now than I did when I was in my 40s. And you look at something like that, and initially on the surface, you say, oh, she's getting healthier. She's got more time. All those things are correct. But if you look at what increasing that muscle mass did for her, she's going to change her. Let's start at the top. She's going to change her risk for all-cause mortality. And I bet you for her, she changed it very close to that 5X that we talked about earlier. She's going to improve her metabolism. Her weight management was in a whole different world. Her risk for blood sugar dysregulation, it was dramatically changed by building this muscle mass up. Her risk for diabetes as a relation of that significantly changed. Her bone health is going to be in a different world over the next, few decades because of the work she has put in now. Her risk of osteoporosis as a byproduct is going to be much, much lower. She's going to have better hormone regulation, even at this age, specifically as she goes through a lot of these changes. She's going to have better mood. She's going to have a much better aging profile. Her cognitive function will remain higher. Her physical activity is going to be able to be much higher. And that leads to her ability to keep that muscle mass. And again, go back to last episode on Blue Zones. The more she stays active, the longer she can live, the more she can contribute and live the life she's supposed to. That is what I think muscle mass as a lead domino can be. Is that if we have that and all these downstream implications are checked, that we can create a situation that allows us to be much, much healthier over the long run because we have tapped into the power of muscle. So if we look at anything, know how important muscle mass is, get tested and check these things. We do a full body fitness assessment for our patients where we check leg strength, we check arm strength, we check core strength, we check balance, and we basically calibrate that based on your body weight and how much weight you should be able to move in terms of being healthy. And I think that's a really good thing for people to do, is know where you're at. So you have a metric, and maybe you retest that a few times a year to know if I'm doing a deadlift, I should be able to do 1.5 of my body weight starting. If I'm doing leg press, I should be able to do at least my body weight for 5 repetitions. That just gets us into the ball game. So there's a lot of things like that we want to know. Where are you at in terms of muscle strength for your body weight? And then start to improve it, start to grow, start to focus on those different areas and get stronger with the volume that you're training. Get closer to failure. Get 3 to 5 repetitions to where you're going to fail, and do 6 to 8 hard sets in a training episode, in a training session, to increase that muscle mass and muscle growth. And do 2 or 3 sessions a week on the areas that you're focused on, but don't focus on a ton. Focus on 2 or 3 areas for, again, that kind of 6 to 12 week session. Those are your volume areas, and each session you're trying to do 6 to 8 hard sets on those. Everything else in between is kind of in maintenance mode. You're still training it, and you're training it quite well, but it's just not the same focus that you are on the areas that you really want to grow for that period of time. And then we just kind of rotate throughout the year. If this stuff resonates with you, I think there's so much that you can do in terms of, talking to a healthcare provider who actually cares about this stuff. I would say in the beginning, either find a really great physical therapist who pays attention to muscle mass a lot. Some functional medicine doctors will be able to guide you in the right direction and give you some great information. I think that digging into this and advocating for your own health and how important this is very, very important. And you're not going to see it with a lot of people. You're not going to see it with a lot of doctors where they understand these mechanisms to a degree that you will, if you study these things, if you listen to this stuff and you kind of pay attention to how important something like muscle mass might be for your overall health, mental health, physical health, hormonal health, chemical health. So I hope that all makes some sense and that inspires you to do a little bit more in terms of muscle mass. If you've been coasting on your exercises, let this episode serve as a kick in the butt to ramp up a couple of days a week and really start getting some strength training where you're getting much closer. Look into Katsu, make sure you're checking your protein intake. And that's basically everything that you probably wanted to know today about how important muscle mass is for your overall health. So to keep myself from rambling on, I'm going to wrap it right here. Remember, do that one thing to get a little bit healthier today. And you know what? Today, try and let that be a strength training session. Have a great day, everybody.